And when it gets to that temperature and we have a tremendous amount of cloud cover, what I've noticed is an increased cloud cover this year, and things just don't dry out. So what we're doing right now is we're talking to a lot of producers across those two provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan, and the moistures are through the roof. Typically, normally guys wouldn't even consider harvesting them, but now we're running out of time. We have to, right? And so that's leading into another problem. Now we've getting grade issues.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today I have with me Greg Peterson from Insight Ag Marketing. We wanted to talk a little bit about crops today, grains, this sort of futures markets, and what's happening truly on the ground with what's coming out of the fields, because we've seen this new article coming out called The Frost Apocalypse. A little overblown in my opinion, but you can find Greg at insightag.com. And also, when we are talking today, it's about farm business solutions, market insights, and then along with this, more risk management, risk assessment, and then the grains itself. And, you know, Greg, you were talking about being involved with the grains here and trading on that side. Again, what the supply is and what you're seeing out in the fields in terms of quality and protein content this year. So I appreciate you coming on, because we had a great talk. You know, before we decided to do an interview here, we talked, and you know, the conversation was effortless, and there was so much information that was flowing between us that I thought for sure that anybody out there that follows my channel at Adapt 2030 would appreciate this, just so we can get a better heads up on, you know, where this is all spilling out into in terms of real yields, because what we've seen with China, minus 37% now on the official records. Before, just even 2 weeks ago, that negative 35% for this year's losses on the grains in China was always, it's been 35 since the summer and the armyworm marched forward, but now they've even stepped that up to 37% total loss of grains in China. So they've increased a couple percent, and you just see around the world, there's a lot of strangeness happening. The record snows early in the West Coast, it's snowing down in Chile, they still got snow, extended seasons in Australia, the mega drought still rolling down there, expected from Kevin Long's forecasts out there for another 4 or 5 years of mega drought in Australia. South Africa's offline because of politics, lower yields across the planet, and then it's getting colder too with the volcanic aerosols, and a lot of things are just mixed up. And regardless of cause, there is an effect called your food price, and where's the food going to come from as we move forward. So Greg, appreciate you having me on here.
Yeah, thanks, David. It's actually really great to be on this channel here. I've been following you for at least a couple of years now. Got a few people converted there to think about this Adapt 2030 business. So it's really interesting what we're seeing right now. For my business, I'm on the ground talking to farmers, not in an agronomic way, but in a way relating to marketing. So I'll deal with guys across Alberta, Saskatchewan mostly, and just talking to them, trying to purchase their grain and send it into Lethbridge, into the feedlot alley there where we feed it to cattle. And that's one part of my business. And then another part is what I do is I help guys market their grain from start to finish. You have one shot to market this grain. How do you go about doing this? So I'm a little different that way. I'm not watching the screen per se from what the USDA is pumping out all the time, or watching the futures and options markets all the time. I do pay attention to that, but I'm actually on the ground watching the local market, which changes things drastically. And we're starting to see that this year. We've had some very, very strange weather. We haven't seen the heat units, right? Or the growing degree days, right? And what that really means is the amount of energy it takes to produce a unit of sugar, basically, right? When your plant is photosynthesizing, right? And so the plant just can't produce that. So what we end up doing is we end up extending this growing season, right? And in Canada, we already have a really, really short growing season. So we don't have that luxury like some other places do of an extra 2 weeks on the back end or an extra 2 weeks in the front end, right? And so last year we saw a snow event in September. It shut everything down for 2-3 weeks. This year, it wasn't a major snow event. We did have snow in Lethbridge, southern Alberta, Saskatchewan, and that down everybody. But fortunately, a lot of those guys were done harvest in that area. Up here, where I'm near Red Deer, Alberta, which is just north of Calgary, about an hour, right in between Calgary and Edmonton. So that gives a reference point for people. We're only about a third, maybe halfway done harvest. And it's behind. There's a lot of stress. And when it gets to that temperature and we have a tremendous amount of cloud cover, what I've noticed is an increased cloud cover this year. And things just don't dry out. So what we're doing right now is we're talking to a lot of producers across those two provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan, and the moistures are through the roof. Typically, normally, guys wouldn't even consider harvesting them, but now we're running out of time. We have to, right? And so that's leading to another problem. Now we've got grade issues, right? Which I know we talk a lot about on this channel, particularly, well, a lot of channels here that are following this Grand Solar Minimum, is our production dropping. What I'm seeing first right now is the production really hasn't dropped a lot, but what we're seeing is the first sign of diseases and lower quality crops, right? And we're starting to see that when the big elevators, the big companies are purchasing it, there's this spread starting to happen already of high quality human consumption grain, right? Wheat, barley, canola, peas, pulse crops. That's the difference or the divergence between a human edible crop versus a feed crop is getting way, way bigger than we've seen in a lot of years. And we've had wrecks before. But this year, it seems like the big companies like the Cargills of the world, they're on the ball to this, right? And they were very sharp at increasing their prices very quickly on high quality human grade type products, right? And we saw that probably with last week, maybe 2 weeks ago, where these divergence would take off. It's been very interesting, right? And so that's a very unique thing. So.
Yeah, because when you said you didn't follow the USDA, and I did up until this year, and I lost all faith in them the way they said that we were going to increase 2% corn production this year with the largest floods ever in American history, the least amount of planting since 1938. And for me, it started to be more of just a market stabilization tool. And reality hit me that they're not really out there to give you the truest of information on what's being put in the fields. Everything's estimates, everything's surveys. But this year it really hit home that even if somebody would have taken a look across the social media, followed the news, even just the weather news, if they would have stayed on any channel XYZ, they would have seen the damage in the fields that, for me, it was very reckless, and it just showed the amount of corruption within the agency that they could come out with such, lowball or crazy forecasts that bankrupt so many farmers. And, they did it a second time again, the same result. And now, they're coming out just today saying that, hey, the frost apocalypse is going to decimate whatever else is out in the field. So, it's perfect timing that we come to today, and then, disclosure literally of we are losing crops in the United States due to the poor conditions of planting and growing through the season, shortened season. Nothing's, there's over 50% that's not mature yet that's coming into this frost, and they're trying to blame the frost, and it's just more of a market stabilization tool. So I agree with you when I say, or when you said, I don't keep my eye to the screen too much, because a lot of it, what you see is, is to avoid people getting scared that their food prices are going to double or, 50% up by the end of the year. And which brings me to the point, the reason I was talking about this, in your opinion, you talked about Cargill pushing prices up already. So to the end consumer, at the wholesalers, the elevator producers, whatever, that's something different when you're talking about bushels and you're bringing in tonnage and getting rail cars full. That's way different animal than you and I shopping at the store. So what do you think this push for the prices at the farm gate level is going to end up at the supermarket retail level in terms of price up?
Well, I think the price is going to start to increase at the supermarket level for sure, right? You just can't go about saying we've got all this crop that's all perfect quality when it's not, when it's going to start trickling down, right? It's not going to be fast. They're not going to double your bread price right away, but they're going to have to adjust it, right? And The one interesting thing about wheat, and I've always been fascinated with this, is wheat is it's got a very inelastic demand curve. It's kind of like the crack cocaine of agricultural commodities. The minute there's a perceived shortage of wheat, it goes straight up the price wise, right? And I think that's because the psychological level and the psychological connection to wheat is so huge, because when the minute you say wheat to somebody, that is automatically associated with bread, right? And so they're not going to be just saying we have a huge shortage of wheat, because these guys, these funds and this Wall Street or whatever you want to call it, the commodity exchanges, they'll rally that thing up really, really fast, right? We could see a doubling in these prices if all of a sudden there was a perceived shortage of good quality growing wheat, right? I do think that is a potential there, right? So what they'll do on the USDA thing, they don't separate, is this a number one good milling wheat, or is it kind of a poor quality stuff, right? Outside of its general classes already. So that's something that we have to watch coming down the pipes. And another thing that you want to watch too is when you're looking here in these USDA numbers, well, they're numbers we have, we need to use them with a grain of salt, but we've also got to get involved with the so-called the Twitter world, watching what's going on in all the other countries. So I follow lots of people from, you name it, Russia, Australia, wherever, right? And you can kind of put the pieces together. Nobody's really saying this and that, but when one trader says this, you're like, oh, well, that makes sense. Or somebody says that, or you hear that on your channel. You start putting the pieces together and you're like, they're not flowing, right? So I've noticed that too.
Yeah, and again, what we saw with the paper trades, take us back to 2008 and 9, everything just went up, but it was mainly on paper. But when we come into the real world here with the real grains, I mean, running paper trades is one thing, but when they get into real stock shortages or inavailability or reduced availability, that's going to take on a whole different element. Because I think my personal opinion is we haven't faced these types of shortages, or what will be soon to be diminished amount of unending buyable stock, as you will. So how's that going to push prices when the real person on the street wakes up and understands that next year out in that field, or in 2 years or 3 years from now, we're not going to be able to grow as much and the quality is going to be poorer or remain poor, and the prices are going to continue up and up and up and up and up year after year, 5 years, decade, and it's going to be never ending increases. Like the psychological difference of, oh, we can grow more next year, the traders will take their profit, they'll exit, and then the prices will come back down. But what if we do get into instead of perceived, into the actual real inavailability for somebody to scrape together enough wheat to keep their factory running, or we get into that type of scenario, an embargo, some type of trade war going on right now, when we get into the true shortages, how is that going to affect? Because the paper trade and then true lack thereof, two different animals. So how do you see and envision that going? Because it's, in my opinion, now you can agree, disagree, anybody out there watching, my opinion is this is the last year of stable grain growing that we're going to get on our planet. From this year forward, it's going to be less and less. That's going to result in true bottlenecks of there's going to be more buyers out there than there will be available supply to keep our world running at today's present level. And somewhere it's got to break, snap, increase, share. I don't know. Something's going to happen. So that's, I guess, my next point there.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, at the end of the day, the farmers have done a very good job in the last 100 years of being able to outproduce population gain and what we're using the product for. But at the end of the day, that product still comes from the sun, right? There's no getting around it. It's photosynthesis that drives this whole system. If that changes at all, you cannot have grain growing or any foods growing from nothing, right? And I see that with excess cloud covers, heat units going down. Yeah, farmers have done an excellent job of being able to produce grain to meet our current needs, right? And we've never had a situation where in recent times in living memory where families have actually had hungry bellies. I think it's like at least 3 generations in North America where people just don't know. And all of a sudden we're going to roll into this thing where we don't produce as much as we used to, or if we do produce, it's low quality. Perhaps it's high in toxins such as an ergot issue or other funguses, right? And we've seen that throughout history. We can say that with the Salem witch trials. I believe that might have been an ergot poisoning, if I'm not mistaken. And so that changes a lot of dynamics now. So what is the average person going to say when last year the price of grain or of bread was this, then all of a sudden they start seeing in the news more and more and more about a crop failure here and a crop failure there in the Western Hemisphere. And the Western Hemisphere is a big, big growing area, right? And I'm not quite so as well versed as you are as where these things are going to come offline first, right? So it'll be interesting to watch.
Where you are, anything 45 north in North America and above. So again, if one thing diminishes in terms of availability of grow condition, can we either substitute a crop, or how far south would that grow zone or that hardiness zone need to shift to be able to still maintain production? And how difficult in reality is it to get land online? So we understand that there's a field, but if you're going to take that field from a field and turn it into a wheat field because it is offline 300 or 400 miles more north, I don't think it's going to be as easy as people think it is to just say, hey, run the tractor and plant a new seed. I honestly don't know. That's a cartoon right there, maybe.
Yeah, and that's a great point about our logistics system that we have. It is designed for our current system, right? We just can't pick up and move to another part of the world and double our production somewhere else. We're not going to go, and some of the land isn't even suitable for growing crops, right? And a lot of people don't realize that, like even in North Canada here, for example, there's places that were settled that should never have been settled. They just don't produce, right? And if they're not producing already, especially in North America, there's got to be a reason why. It's probably because they're not productive already. There's other parts of the world where you have some political issues involved. So how do you get that sorted out? Especially when you have other countries starting to get at each other's necks for certain things, right? So you just don't go out there and say, like you said, I'm going to go grab this person's field and start producing grain on it. It doesn't work, right? It's a whole host of problems.
Yeah, and geopolitically as well, if food does become that expensive or it's a little bit more difficult to get into the silo, geopolitically, if they're already fighting for energy resources, rare earth minerals, fishing rights or whatever it is, oil and gas drilling rights, that's nothing. We need none of that. If you don't eat, you don't need any of those other things behind you because you don't eat. You got to eat first. Food first and foremost.
Yeah.
So, the precedent of getting a food supply for your citizens will usurp any type of, dealings to try to get energy, because the energy would be a moot point without the food first.
Yeah, it's that's kind of the history of our world, right? Is scarce resources. How do you put them into production, right? And food is one of them. So another thing we're seeing too is, we didn't really talk about this, as the grade starts to go down and as we don't get these nice hot summers like we've seen, or growing seasons throughout the world, North America, I guess Europe, and European Union is a huge producer of wheat, right? So is Russia. I sent you those charts too, right? Where it shows you the total production. And if those go offline, that's probably about maybe a quarter of our production right there, right? And that's a big question of then what?
Yeah, because I'm pulling up the charts that you did send me here, and one of the startling was as we take a look at the top 12 global wheat producers, the only one that's giving us excess production is, drum roll please, which country do you think it is? With the ending wheat stocks, what's that telling us? Because what we're looking at here, let me see if I can put this on. I'll bring it up so we can see it anyway. But take a look at how far China is above the rest of everybody else way down south there. I'm going to put this chart up in the talk here so we can see it a little bit larger. But what is it with China? Why are they importing so much? How are they able to keep such large wheat ending stocks when everybody else is at minimal levels? Do they have like an underground tunnel where they're bringing it in? I know they had that exclusive with Kazakhstan right next door. You get this. Now, Kazakhstan borders right there in Xinjiang. If you go far out west in China, you come to Xinjiang where they're having a lot of problems anyway. Silk Road, ran right through there, continued over into Kazakhstan. But I was reading that they had an exclusive with Kazakhstan for the next 5 years of wheat production paid in advance, full. Every grain of wheat coming out of Kazakhstan is bound for China, inbound, except for what they're going to use within their own country.
Yeah.
But, interestingly, parts of Xinjiang are becoming much, much wetter too, off the mountains that are there. It seems that when you read the tales of the old Silk Road traders, people always talk about walking through forest, fruit orchards, rivers were running, there were monasteries, trading posts, all these types of things, gardens, fields, and everything. Totally dry, barren desert now. But it seems that the rain patterns returning there where they're starting to get a lot more tree growth, natural grasses, some streams are running again. And we've seen the same thing in Afghanistan. Some of those rivers, I've done more than a handful of videos on rivers and stream beds inside Afghanistan that are running after 2,500 years again due to the excessive rainfall. And we saw these massive floods in Iran. Never talked about even in the Silk Road days of these types of rains and floods that are in Iran right now. So if you're going back 2,500 years in record and they haven't ever experienced anything to that magnitude of flooding in Iran, I understand if topography's changed, there's been some dams built, etc. But I can't believe that it would be that far over the top where they can't find anything going back 2,500 years to the Arab traders connecting to the Silk Road where they've never had that big of floods before. So something's definitely changed in terms of rainfall. And, that Xinjiang basin out there getting a little bit wetter, as well as Qinghai and that downslope off the Himalaya down into the Tarim Basin there. I lived in China. I like to travel there in my free time when I was working. So I've been out to a lot of places so I can whip off the names.
One thing I want to say about that ending stocks with China, that's not just because they have a whole bunch of extra. That's a political play, right? That's the only thing I can see it. Why would they be almost a full year production in their ending stocks and everybody else keeps it around, I think like 17% or nothing extravagant, right? Why would they do that? That's the question, right? And I believe in some of the previous episodes you've talked about is every time there's a grand solar minimum, I believe the Chinese dynasty's changed. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. Well, they lose the mandate from heaven because they can't feed their people.
Mm-hmm.
So again, that goes right in there. A full year. Imagine if they were cut off, and they would still at least have a year of maneuvering. And then the Chinese are willing to bend over backwards to support the cause. So that might actually be able to stretch to 2 years, and people would adjust their consumption patterns on other things. Maybe they'll switch to algae. I don't know. But anyway, they would do the utmost to keep that the society intact.
Yeah. So when I look at that chart, because I see it's 100%, it's got to be 100% political. There's no other reason. Why would you do that, right? If you know you're going to have a crop year after year after year, why would you store that much, right? So that's the way I look at it, right? So it's a confirmation to me that there is something happening. Big governments know that, and also talking about how dynasties would fall during grand solar minimums. They probably don't want that to happen to them this time, right? So it's an interesting thing to think about.
Now, with the low ending stocks for the rest of the countries down there, you say 17-ish%, something around, let's say 20, we'll round it off to even. How difficult would that be to restock if we're starting to get into some of these decreased quality yields and some shortages that we're seeing across the way? I mean, Australia's become a net wheat importer this year because of the drought. And, Kevin Long, I've done an interview with him. He runs a site called thelongview.au.com or .com.au, The Long View. And what he's done is in the Murray Basin down there, he has taken a look back in history and found the drought cycle mixed with a monsoon cycle based on the solar cycle, and also he does some lunar nodal type of thing in there mixed in. Is we got a formula of all those heavens and earth, and he come out, and then the new drought cycle that he's predicting is going to run through a mega drought. And when I say mega, you have not seen anything yet. It is still very wet comparatively to the way he thinks it's going into. There's going to be zero production almost coming out of there. It's going to get that dry. And he says another 4 to 5 years of almost no precipitation in Australia. So, Australia used to be a major exporter to other places, Indonesia, China, other nations that, would they export 11 million tons, something like that.
Yeah.
That's a lot. So somebody else is going to be searching for that. So if Australia decided that they have to now import and then their previous buyers can't get the supply that used to come out of Australia, where do we get with this shell game and shifting everywhere? If these supplies are not going to be there and the quality is not going to be there, I mean, really, how much longer can the shell game continue before the general populace of the planet wakes up and says, uh-oh, we do have some sort of food difficulties here?
Yeah, that actually almost happened last year, where it almost made sense to ship grain from Canada to Australia. Almost made sense, right? So it's it's coming down the pipes where things are starting to shift. And the answer to your question about how do you rebuild these ending stocks, that's a political issue, because farmers, they need to sell their crop to make money, right? So they need to be incentivized to store it, right? And right now, in most of these countries, Canada, I don't think they're incentivized to store it for a long term, right? So, and with the way the farms are right now, we've based ourselves around this massive industrial scale of farming, which has brought on a tremendous amount of debt. So now these farmers are forced to sell to pay off their debts. So that has to change. There has to be some kind of political incentive to increase the ending stocks. I believe there it has to be, right? Or some major issue that prevents us from selling, right? Other than that, we have to sell.
So what's coming with the debt? Are the farmers able to, the farmers, I should say, with their farms, are they able to establish credit and buy out on credit? Because I've seen in some stories where, the banks just aren't loaning, or the institutions just aren't loaning to farmers due to, 3 years of crop insurance claims, and they're really unable to grow. But they're like, we think this year we can actually get it in the ground. We just need the money. But there's a formula that they're using as well for risk assessments to see should they give out the loans, and just the hearsay. And if you look at Zero Hedge, which is a site I like to look at, there's been a more than a plethora of articles talking about very difficult for farmers to now start getting some loans for machinery, seeds, and fertilizer, et cetera, like that, to move forward, because there's been so many losses in the last few years. To move forward, banks are not going to take the risk.
Yeah, unfortunately, Canada is a little different. We do have very specific agricultural lending institutions that are backed by the government, right? Even though they're not, but they are. So they are very supportive for the farmers, right now, right? But we haven't hit a real bad year yet either. Like this year, the crop's late, the quality is going to be down, but the volume wasn't terrible either. So we'll offset some of these the loss in revenue via production this year, right? So, and then if some of these guys have good quality crops, they're going to actually make quite a bit of money this year, right? But if our production starts to drop and the quality's down, no one's paying for quality. It's below the cost of production, right? And then if you throw in disease issues, like if you throw ergot in there, well, now you have to clean it, right? That's an extra expense, and it's not real cheap to do that, especially when there's piles of ergot kicking around. We are actually seeing that this year. I've actually never seen so much in my career of this guy saying it's this high ergot, right? And that's not nice stuff. I believe it's very similar to the LSD chemical. Similar anyways. I don't think you should try it. But there is a history with it, a very long history in the history of mankind. So, and other diseases that we're going to start running into too. We're starting to see that with the canola this year. Farmers I'm talking to from all over are saying, wow, this disease, there's one called sclerotinia. We haven't seen that for a lot of years, and I have never seen it so bad. But the sheer green volume is there because we had a very wet year.